Good evening, and welcome to another session of Monk Chat. Our weekly opportunity to ask all the questions that you might like to ask. Please type in your questions, and as soon as some questions appear, then I'll start offering answers. If no questions appear within a short period of time, then I will conclude that nobody's interested in asking questions and I won't give any answers. So I don't see any questions yet. I see a few people are watching, and Geeta has already checked in. So hello, Geeta, possibly our most dedicated participant. So always good to see you joining in. And hello, Kumu, another one of our regulars. Good to see you as well. And Jayanta, always wonderful to see you, both online and in person. And I see a few more people joining in. Hello, Patricia. However, I still don't see any questions. Hello, Sam. So if somebody could ask a question and get us started. Aha. So Gita says, please explain in brief taming, training, transcending, and transforming our mind. Well, I don't know who came up with that particular set of four. It's quite nice sounding, but it doesn't sound like anything directly from the suttas. So I can only talk in general terms because whoever came up with that set of four would know what they meant by it. But since it's not something that the Buddha used, I can only create my own interpretation rather than just talk about the suttas. So taming, I would probably take as meaning restraining the mind from unwholesome states. So, for example, practices of morality, actually. So not killing and not stealing and not cheating and not lying and not using intoxicants and so on. So taming, what is it to tame an animal, for example? It's to take it from a wild, savage animal and make it into a relatively peaceful and harmless animal. So I think that's the first step in Buddhist practice, is taming our wild, savage, animalistic side, taming our instinctual, impulsive side. Next, training. Again, training, transcending, and transforming, these actually all kind of go together, and depending upon the day, I could explain any one of those three using more or less the same words. But I would say training, taking on the training of Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. So there's the basic Sila, which is restraining our animalistic urges. And then there's the more advanced Sila of cultivating kindness, compassion, generosity, promoting concord and harmony between people. So the basic level of Sila is avoiding unwholesome conduct. And the more advanced level of Sila is actively cultivating the opposite. So actively cultivating the wholesome. So this is spoken about in a number of suttas. So most of the time in the suttas, the Buddha talks about refraining from unwholesome conduct, refraining from harsh speech, refraining from divisive speech, and so on. Refraining from killing, refraining from injuring, and so on. But in a number of suttas, the Buddha talks in a positive way of saying, practicing gentle speech, practicing harmonizing speech, helping others, and so on. That's the advanced level of Sila, so the training level of Sila. And practicing Samadhi is also a very important element of training the mind. Cultivating sati, so mindfulness. And transcending the mind, that's when we start getting into Panya, I would probably say. So recognizing that the mind is ultimately a part of nature. It's not who we are. And there's nothing solid or persistent or stable anywhere in body or mind. So then one starts to let go of one's attachment to body-mind and all the phenomena experienced through body-mind. And transforming our mind, well, actually, that would be attaining awakening. So when one reaches any stage of awakening, then that's an irreversible transformation. So just off the top of my head, this is a brief interpretation of one way to understand this sequence of 4. And Mike says, how can I fix a metta practice that gets interrupted by distracting thoughts and sometimes ill will? By using a different approach. Now, it sounds like whatever approach you're using is not very interesting to you, which is why you keep getting distracted. So it's very important to have a way of meditating that is interesting to us. So it's good to experiment with different ways of practicing and find ways that you like doing, that you find interesting and enjoyable. And then it's much easier to stay with your meditation if you actually like it and find it interesting. I would also, though, emphasize that our conduct during meditation is heavily influenced by what we do outside of meditation. So make an effort to cultivate gentleness of mind at all times, and then you'll find that metta is much easier. Gita clarifies that the set of 4 was said by Venerable Tenzin Palmo. Okay. Then Kumu says, the word samatha is translated as serenity. Can you please explain? Is samatha a precursor for sati to be developed? So samatha literally means peacefulness. So it's from the root sam, which means peace, and the suffix ta, which means the quality or the aspect or the characteristic. So samatha means peacefulness. So samatha is peacefulness of mind, which is it's cultivated in many different ways. Is it a precursor for sati? Not necessarily. You can actually be mindful of agitation. You can be mindful of an unsettled mind. And that can be an inroad to mindfulness. Actually, for many people, it's very difficult to practice samatha, peacefulness of mind, tranquility of mind. So one of the suggestions that's often made for someone like that is to be mindful of your distractible, excitable, agitated mind. Watch as it jumps all over the place. And that can lead to the development of sati. Samatha can help in the developing of sati, but it's good to keep in mind that samatha itself is simply peacefulness or tranquility. So samatha without sati leads to sleepiness, which is not particularly useful. So in order for samatha to become samadhi, it has to be combined with sati. So samatha combined with sati produces samadhi. So sometimes when talking, sometimes teachers will equate samatha with samadhi, but that's not quite correct. Samatha just means peacefulness, whereas samadhi is peacefulness with alertness, with strong sati. And Pial asks, are corruptions of insight, overestimation of oneself, and restlessness for release equivalent to the last 2 fetters to be broken, that is, conceit and restlessness? I would say they're related, but not equivalent. So the last 2 fetters of the 5 higher fetters are extremely subtle. So keep in mind, these are things which are all that remains in the mind of a non-returner. All that keeps a non-returner from attaining awakening. Whereas corruptions of insight are things that can appear in anybody, whether they've attained any stage of awakening or not. So overestimating oneself, You certainly don't have to be a non-returner to have that. In fact, that's extremely common. Restlessness for release. Let me briefly look up this sutta. There's something about it that sounds a bit off to me. So in Anguttara Nikaya 4.170, let's see. 4.170, I'm getting up here as the Yogananda Sutta, which I don't think is the one you're referring to. Yeah, the Yogananda Sutta doesn't talk about corruptions of insight. So unless you're talking about another sutta, I'm also looking a couple ahead and a couple back. No, I'm not finding the sutta that you're talking about. So Pial, if you could check the reference and make sure that you're referencing the right sutta, because I just looked at Anguttara Nikaya 4.170 as well as 2 before and 2 after, and I didn't find it. So I'm not sure what you're referring to. But just from your question, I would say no. Those 2 corruptions of insight are things that can appear in anyone, whereas the last 2 fetters are extremely subtle mind states, which are present only in a non-returner. So they're present in the very subtle remnants of self-attachment, self-identity, and self-attachment. Gita says, Bhante, you have spoken about anamitta samadhi in the past. Can you please speak a bit about this type of samadhi? Yeah, I mean, I'll say a little bit. And if I get started talking about anamitta samadhi, and I can talk for a long time about anamitta samadhi, I could also talk very briefly about it. Briefly speaking, it's when one lets go of all objects. One lets go of all objects of mind, all objects of awareness. So one ceases distinguishing between separate phenomena. One ceases labeling or identifying any object. One ceases moving out towards any experience or pushing away any experience. One ceases even the concept of a being that is experiencing. So ultimately, anamitta samadhi is the practice of letting go of all things, which is actually how the Buddha describes it when he talks about how to practice anamitta samadhi. It's just letting go of all objects, letting go of all things, not paying attention to anything that appears. So this means not creating anything with the mind, not creating any distinctions or objects of mind. So that's a very brief way of talking about it. So Pial says, last method of Anguttara Nikaya 4.170. I just looked at it and it doesn't mention anything about corruptions of insight, and it doesn't mention anything about overestimation of oneself or restlessness for release. Yeah, so I'm looking at the 4th method, and then it doesn't mention Vipassanupa Kilesa, it doesn't mention overestimation of oneself, and it doesn't mention restlessness for release. So it's not here in the Yogananda Sutta. So I'm not sure what you're looking at, because I'm looking right at the text and I don't see it. And if you want to ask about what this 4th method is, so Dhammodacha Vigahita, I can talk about that. So Dhammodacha Vigahita. So Vigahita literally means to be seized or grabbed. Uddacha means agitation, and Dhamma means, actually can mean many different things. And this is what has led to a lot of debate. So there's a lot of debate about what this refers to. So Dhammodacha Vigahita, what does it mean to be seized by agitation in Dhamma, or agitation about Dhamma, or agitation in terms of Dhammas? What does it mean? And there's so many different interpretations, and they mostly hinge around how one interprets the word Dhamma. So if you take the word Dhamma to mean phenomena, then that gives one meaning to this. If you take Dhamma to mean the teachings of the Buddha, that gives a completely different meaning to this. If you take Dhamma as meaning specifically mental phenomena or mental objects, then that gives another meaning to this. So there's many ways of interpreting this Dhammodacha Vigahita. So what does it mean to have a mind which is seized by agitation about Dhamma or in Dhamma? Well, actually, one theory is that this is very similar to the Zen practice of koan contemplation, where you have a question which is basically unsolvable. And in asking yourself the question, the mind becomes agitated about Dhamma until eventually it stumbles upon an answer, almost accidentally. It stumbles upon a deep realization. So that's one theory about an example of a modern method of meditation which intentionally tries to produce Dhammodacha Vigahita. But in outside of that particular Chan practice, generally speaking, I don't know of any Buddhist tradition which actively tries to cultivate this method. So Dhammodacha Vigahita. Usually the focus is on the previous three, which are different ways of practicing samatha and vipassana. But the last one, agitation about Dhamma, that's the only way I know of which is deliberately cultivating that as a method. Okay, next one. Kumu asks, for Anapanasati meditation and the 16 steps in the meditation, is it only the awareness of breaths that is needed to be developed and not any thoughts about different aspects of the breaths? So if you look at the 16 steps, awareness of breathing, and it's how it starts. It starts simply with being aware of the overall shape of the breath, aware if it's long or short. But from there, it develops into a much more detailed process of developing first serenity, so stilling the body, then going into developing euphoria of body, developing a peaceful and happy mind, and then cultivating self-awareness, so awareness of mind, and then finally into cultivating perceptions of insight. And all of that is done around the framework of awareness of the breath. So awareness of breathing goes throughout the whole process, but you are using the breath as your kind of your momentum to develop these other qualities of mind. So for example, breathing in, I will experience euphoria. Breathing out, I will experience euphoria. The idea is not to think about that. It's actually to train yourself in building up a sense of euphoria in your body while you breathe in. So just as when you breathe in, you can feel the breath building up in your body. Well, also as you breathe in, can you build up euphoria in your body? And as you breathe out, you can feel a sense of ease and relaxation in the body. So as you breathe out, can you build up that sense of euphoria in the body? So this is what's meant by breathing in, I will experience euphoria. Breathing out, I will experience euphoria. It isn't a thought, it's a training, like lifting weights. When you're lifting weights, you're not thinking about lifting weights, but nonetheless, you're doing a practice which is building up strength in the body. So that's what the Anapanasati meditation is, the 16-step Anapanasati meditation. It's using the constant in and out motion of the breathing as kind of a driving momentum that keeps pushing you to keep developing these wholesome states of mind, which again, it begins simply with bare mindfulness, so a very basic level of mindfulness. And from that, it builds into developing samadhi and eventually to developing insight, panya. Sam asks, in between full eradication of desires versus rest on awareness, which state is closer to state of Nirvana? The first one, full eradication of desires. Rest on awareness. Yeah, I mean, just look at a cat. They're resting on awareness, but they're nowhere near Nibbana. But full eradication of desires is actually one of the ways that the Buddha defined Nibbana. In several places in the suttas, the Buddha defined Nibbana simply as the complete absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. That's Nibbana. But rest on awareness, I mean, that's helpful. That can help you cultivate, well, samatha and sati, as I was talking about earlier. But samatha and sati by themselves are nowhere near nibbana. They're just they're moving in the right general direction, I suppose. But they're not sufficient by themselves. And Kumu was expressing appreciation about the simile on lifting weights for anapanasati. Good, glad that was helpful. And I don't see any other questions right now. So if you do have more questions, please type them in the next few seconds. So when the flow of questions stop, then the flow of answers stops. And when the flow of answers stops, then the live stream stops. So if you want things to keep going, then we need to keep up the flow of questions. Okay. Okay, this is technically a question, and it is vaguely related to Buddhism, so I will answer it. Diana asks, Bante, how was Italy? Well, so I was just in Italy for 3 weeks or so. It was great. I was actually really impressed at how many people in Italy are interested in Buddhism these days. But what particularly impressed me was that the people who are interested in Buddhism seem to be interested in genuine traditional Buddhism. So whereas in America, there's a lot of efforts to secularize Buddhism by stripping away the religious components. I didn't get any of that when I was in Italy. Instead, people seem to be very interested in getting the full orthodox traditional Buddhist teachings. So talking about karma, talking about rebirth, talking about past lives and future lives, talking about angels and demons and different states of being has no problem, no resistance. And similarly, there was an understanding of the value of monasticism and a deep respect for monastics. So I found that all quite lovely. I found that there was this sense of deep appreciation for an Orthodox tradition that had been maintained for thousands of years. And a wish to know that tradition instead of a wish to modify or accommodate that tradition. So overall, I was actually quite impressed with how Buddhism is developing in Italy. I think it's extremely promising and very healthy and going in a very good direction. Gita asks, how can we test ourselves if we were on the correct path? Well, I'll actually give you an answer that my preceptor gave to me when I once asked him a question about a practice I was doing and if he thought it was a good practice or not. And his answer was, if wholesome mind states are increasing and unwholesome mind states are decreasing, then it's a good practice. So that's your basic guideline to ask yourself if you're practicing correctly. The question is, are wholesome states increasing and unwholesome states decreasing? If the answer is yes, then you're on the right track. So you might be able to improve how you're practicing, but you at least know you're going in the right general direction. And Sam asks, I have strong aversion when engaging in Dhamma discussion with Dharma friends from other traditions, such as Tibetan tradition. How can I overcome? Look for the commonalities. Talk about the commonalities. Look for things that you can appreciate about the practices they do, the trainings they do, the teachings they like, the methods they like. Look for things you can appreciate and praise. And look for the things which are similar to the practices that you do and from the tradition that you like. So forge a sense of appreciation through the commonalities. Another thing which can be very helpful is to look to see where they have a similar practice, but where it's maybe explained in more detail or fleshed out more fully. So an example, which was one of my early moments of having a deeper appreciation of Tibetan Buddhism. So it was many years ago, probably 12 years ago, was I was reading a book, and it was from the Tibetan tradition, and it went into an incredibly detailed explanation of how to do Brahmavihara meditation. Like far more detailed than anything I'd ever seen by any Theravada teacher. And I didn't necessarily use those instructions, but I was incredibly impressed by the depth and the detail and the precision of this explanation of how to do the 4 Brahmaviharas in meditation. So that was one thing which gave me some appreciation. So look for things that you can appreciate, things that you can relate to and that you can see value in. And the other things, well, just accept it as different, and maybe someday you'll find a way of relating to it where you can appreciate it. But for now, look for things that are easy to appreciate. And Amaranta says, can you recommend some books about recollection of the Buddha? The Suttas? I mean, that's what always works for me, is just reading the Suttas, because you can feel the Buddha speaking through every sutta. You get the sense of his voice, his personality. It comes through in these ancient words. So for me, that's actually enough. I just read the suttas, and there's this tangible sense of the presence of the Buddha. I mean, some people, they like to read about the life of the Buddha, though this gets a bit complicated because there's a lot of apocryphal information that gets all mixed in, and sometimes it's hard to know what's what. But if that isn't a problem for you, if that doesn't bother you, then yeah, I mean, just read it and enjoy it. There's actually a lot of books about the Buddha's life, and they all seem to have somewhat different details. But if you're not so worried about the details, then it doesn't matter. Pial says, maybe it is in the commentary. Yeah, corruptions of insight well under control. Let me look again at the sutta here. Yeah, I think this is another case where the commentary just makes things up. I really don't understand. Like every now and then the commentary just invents random things and tries to insert them in the suttas, and I really don't get why. So I think this is a case of it. I don't see this text as having anything whatsoever to do with the Vipassanaupakalesas. So I think the commentary just like made something up for no good reason. Wouldn't be the first time. And Sukrajaran says, in Italy, is Theravada or Mahayana Buddhism there? Both. So there's both Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. Quite a bit of both. Yeah. And Brian says, in an earlier talk, you spoke about being able to choose one's next rebirth. Can you please expand on that and its nuances? The main discourse, which is usually referred to for this, is called the Sankarupapatti Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya, which in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, he translates it as rebirth through aspiration, which is it's an okay enough translation, I suppose. It gets the point across anyway. The Buddha talks about two necessary components to choosing one's rebirth. One is sufficient good karma. So you need to build up a lot of merit through doing mundane good works. So doing a lot of generosity, a lot of kindness, a lot of compassion. So a lot of ordinary good karma. That's the fuel behind the ability to direct your rebirth. And the other important component is the aspiration. So you need to have a focused mind on what kind of rebirth you want to have. So a clear determination of the kind of rebirth that you want to have. And if you have sufficient good karma and a strong enough focus, then you'll get the rebirth that you're after. There's actually an entire school of Buddhism based upon this principle. It's called Pure Land. So Pure Land Buddhism is based upon building up a lot of good karma and having a very strong aspiration to be reborn in a particular world system, which is said to have ideal conditions for practicing Buddhism. Sometimes Pure Land Buddhism gets criticized in Theravada circles, but it's actually based upon principles that are found in the Pali Suttas. Kumo asks, what are your recommendations for a few suttas to read from the Digha Nikaya? Read number 2 and number 16 so far. They're both amazing, but still not completed Majjhima Nikaya. Finish the Majjhima first. I usually recommend that people read the Majjhima, Samyutta, and Anguttara before reading the Digha. But that's my own preference. Some people actually really like the Digha Nikaya, but for me, it's not my favorite. It's my least favorite of the Nikayas. So there are a few which I particularly like. I'll pull up the table of contents right now and just give a shout out to a few Digha suttas. Actually, I like the Brahmajala Sutta, the Samanyapala Sutta, Kuttadanta Sutta. I seem to recall liking that one. I love the Mahasihanada Sutta. That one's great. It's actually been a while since I've read the Digha. Mahanadana Sutta is great. Mahasatipatthana, of course, is a classic. Sigalovada Sutta is another classic. Sometimes it's called the layperson's Vinaya, the Sigalovada Sutta. Atanatya Sutta is kind of fun if you like devas and magic powers and things. So those are a few Digha suttas which I like. But really, I recommend just reading through it cover to cover so you get the whole picture. But to do so after you finish the other Nikayas. PL asks, can you speak a little bit about Yoniso Manasikara? Yeah, so Yoniso Manasikara is usually translated as wise attention, which is a fair enough translation. It's not quite literally precise, but it's decent enough. So the Buddha says that Yonaso Manasikara is when you carefully consider what the proper way to direct your mind is. So how to direct the mind in a way that reduces your defilements and produces wisdom. So one example he gives, for example, in the Sabbasava Sutta, is to contemplate the Four Noble Truths. That'd be an example of Yoniso Manasikara. Another example of Yonaso Manasikara is when you're experiencing a painful sensation, you consider whether this is something to be endured or something to be avoided. So, for example, if something is actually damaging you to the point where it might inhibit your practice, then that's to be avoided. But if it's not something obstructive to one's practice, then it's to be endured. So the distinction is known through Yoniso Manasikara, so carefully paying attention to what's going on. And it has the particular connotation, this word Yoniso Manasikara, it has the particular connotation of understanding what leads towards awakening and what leads away. So it's not just an ordinary intelligence, but rather it's the ability to distinguish what contributes to the path of awakening and what detracts from it. Sam asks, what is commentaries? And how do we know which section in the sutta is commentaries? So commentaries are one thing and suttas are another. So if you're reading the suttas and you're just reading the suttas, then in theory, you're not reading the commentaries. This isn't 100% true because sometimes, actually depressingly often, translators will translate in accordance with the commentaries' explanations rather than in accordance with what's actually written in the sutta text. And often you don't know the difference unless you read the original Pali text. Sometimes in the footnotes of a translation, it will explain when it's drawing the translation from commentary rather than from suttas, but not always. So that can be problematic. If you compare multiple translations, then sometimes that also can illuminate when there's different interpretations of a section. But ultimately, the only real way to know is to learn Pali and read it in Pali. Or if you're not certain about something, then to ask a scholar to explain to you whether something is from the suttas or whether it's been influenced by the commentaries. So the commentaries were apocryphal texts produced hundreds of years after the Buddha, so they're not to be relied upon. PL asks, Streamwinner is endowed with virtues that are appealing to the noble ones. What does it mean? The 5 precepts or more than that? The 5 precepts are the minimum. If you're not practicing the 5 precepts, then you're not going to become a stream winner, Sotapanna, that's for sure. So yeah, the 5 precepts are your absolute bare bones minimum. But a stream mentor is a step beyond that. So a stream mentor has an effortless morality, an effortless harmlessness in their conduct, which is significantly more refined than just following the 5 precepts. So as I mentioned earlier, the 5 precepts are all just about avoiding the most harmful kinds of behavior. But the development of right virtue is going a step beyond and actively cultivating the opposite of the things that we avoid in the 5 precepts. So actively cultivating the wholesome side of that. So actively trying to help people, actively practicing generosity, actively cultivating trustworthiness and social harmony, actively practicing honesty and cultivating right speech, actively cultivating a stable, restrained, and alert mind. So that's the virtues appealing to the noble ones, the sila, the morality that's noble, it's appealing to the noble ones. Kauser Friend says, I recently finished the Majjhima Nikaya and have now moved on to Samyutta Nikaya. I find the verses to be a bit hard to get through. I might skip ahead and return to them later. Yeah, that's okay, as long as you do, in fact, come back and read them later. There's actually a lot of good stuff in the verses, but if it's a struggle for you, you can come back to it later. But there is a lot of good material in there. Admittedly, I find the rest of the Samyutta more interesting, but the chapter of verses there's some good stuff in there. So Ian says, I've heard several times that with correct wisdom and compassion, a bodhisattva can kill, and this is skillful means. They always acknowledge this is bad karma, regardless of the suffering you may have lessened. This has been a long-term topic I struggle with. I always return to killing is not okay ever, but wanted to hear your thoughts on this. Yeah, so there is such a thing as mixed karma. So karma, which is both good and bad. So an example of this actually is you might be killing out of compassion. So then you're generating the bad karma of killing, but you're also generating good karma because of the compassionate motive. So that's mixed karma, and it will produce both good results and bad results. Because you've done both good karma and bad karma, then you'll get both results, both good and bad. They don't cancel out. You get both. This is an important point. Good karma does not cancel out bad karma. Rather, you get the results of both. So I would hesitate to say a bodhisattva can kill. Rather, I would say that a bodhisattva might kill, but that a bodhisattva killing is actually an indication that they're not yet awakened. It's an indication that they're still under the influence of defilement and delusion. Because an awakened being would never deliberately kill. That's part of what defines an awakened being. This is clearly stated in many suttas. An awakened being would never deliberately kill another sentient being. It's unthinkable. It's impossible for them. It's just something they cannot do. So, but the nature of a bodhisattva is that a bodhisattva, by definition, is not yet fully awakened. So that means a bodhisattva, by definition, still has defilement and delusion. So they may still act from those defilements and delusions. However, a bodhisattva usually also has strongly developed many very wholesome qualities of mind. And in particular, compassion is often very highly developed. So then they'll often be making choices which are strongly influenced by wholesome mind states, but which are being tainted by the remaining defilement and delusion in their mind. So that might lead to a bodhisattva, for example, deciding to kill, thinking that that's a good idea. Well, that's once again proof that they're not yet fully enlightened. So I don't recommend imitating that kind of behavior because it will just delay your progress towards awakening. And Kayla says, how does one choose which tradition or school of Buddhism is right for them? I appreciate what each one has to offer, and I have trouble deciding which path I should choose. Well, I recommend that you keep practicing with them until you find one that really seems to suit you. So it's not easy to say. Maybe if I knew you in person and I knew you quite well, then maybe I could make a specific recommendation. But otherwise, you're just going to have to figure it out for yourself. So it's through experience with different styles of practice that you figure out what works for you and what you feel a strong connection with, a strong affinity with. So yeah, just keep trying out different ways of practices and see what you feel very strongly connected with, strongly drawn to. And PL asks, the faith follower and the Dhamma follower both will not die without being stream winners. This is cited in the sutta. Can you comment, please? Yeah, so the subject of the faith follower and the Dhamma follower. Well, first off, let me pull up this text while I talk a bit. They're mentioned in a handful of suttas, but the Buddha actually never goes into a detailed definition of these. Let me check again that sutta reference, 25.1. Yeah, so this is one case where it seems to be equating the Dhamma follower and the faith follower with somebody who is not yet a stream enterer, but they have sufficiently developed uh, a momentum, an irreversible momentum in their practice, which means they will become a stream enterer before they pass away. Interestingly enough, Dhamma follower and faith follower are defined slightly differently in some other suttas, but that's, I think, getting into a deeper topic than you're asking about here. So just going off how it's spoken about in that sutta, then it's simply saying someone who, in the case of a faith follower, their faith in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha is so strong that eventually they'll make the breakthrough to stream entry. And a Dhamma follower, their wisdom is so well developed that they're definitely going to eventually become a stream enterer. That's all that really means. So it's talking about two approaches to practice. So one is through the approach of strong faith, and the other is through the approach of strong wisdom. Then M says, often greed is given as the first cause in the world. I don't know who says that because it's not a Buddhist thing to say. The Buddha said there is no first cause for anything. You cannot find a first cause. You cannot find a starting point. You cannot find a beginning. No matter how far back you look, there is no beginning. So I don't know who says greed is the first cause in the world, because that it's not a Buddhist statement. Now, there is no first cause. There is no starting point. There is no beginning. Rather, what we see is a beginningless, endless cycle of causality. That's what we see. And at some point, we become so wearied with this that we decide we want to break out of it. And that's what Buddhism is for. Then you ask, could the Big Bang have been caused by greed? I would put it a bit differently. I would say we are experiencing our current state of existence because of greed. That's what I would say. And our current state of existence also includes Big Bangs. So in that sense, I guess you could say the Big Bang was caused by greed, but it's kind of a roundabout way of talking. The more accurate way would be saying that experiencing a world which contains Big Bangs is caused by greed. That would be a more accurate way of saying it. And that's the last of the questions from online. So I'll give it a moment and see if any other questions appear. So I'm not seeing anything else. So if nothing else appears, then I think we'll call that enough for this time. Anything from the residents? No? Okay. So that looks like it for this evening. So thank you all for your questions and participation. It's always lovely to have these discussions. And so it looks like PL might be starting to type a question. Maybe not. So we'll go ahead and end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.